Hi, welcome to Breakthrough Ideas and Training webinar series. I'm Cordell Riley, President of Toronto Training. My pleasure to be with you today. It's also my pleasure to welcome to the session Chris Kirchner. Chris is Senior Consultant with ROI Institute here in Charlotte. Chris, welcome to the session.
Hi, Cordell. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Super. Glad you took the time to join us, and obviously the other training professionals that decided to come in and watch this session. Chris, obviously, we're going to focus today, as the name of your organization implies, is ROI. And obviously, what we're going to focus on is bottom line ROI, evaluating the performance of training and development programs is kind of what we're going to focus on. Chris, before we kind of get into the topic, and why don't you take a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the ROI Institute, if you would, please.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I work with the ROI Institute, and I'm a senior consultant there. Kind of an interesting background for me and how I got involved with training, but experiential marketing has been my career path. And that's anything interactive with an audience where we ultimately want them to do something. And when I got involved with the ROI Institute, was introduced to the training field, and it's a similar call to action where we're working with an audience and we ultimately want them to do something that's different or unique or better than what they've been doing in the past. But where we focus is helping on the design of the program and in such a way that we can also measure the performance of that, including ROI.
Super, super. How long have you been doing this again, Chris?
So I've actually been working with the Institute for a little over 2 years, but I was following Jack's methodology as a marketer as well. This is universal in that any project, program, or initiative, we can evaluate the performance, including ROI. So altogether, probably about 5 years have been following this methodology.
Super, super. Thank you for that. So, Chris, you obviously touched on training, and again, that's kind of the topic at hand, and obviously we're focusing on bottom line results and measuring ROI as it relates to training. Again, we obviously have a lot of training experts that have decided to join this session. So, Chris, you've obviously had a lot of business background, and you've been around businesses and organizations. Can I get you just for a second to talk about the impact that you think training has on a business and organization, what training can and should be doing for an organization? Can you just touch on that for a second?
Yeah, so what we're actually seeing in the industry is that human capital analytics is sort of a buzzword and a trend right now. And that's looking at how do we evaluate the investment in the human resources in our people in the same way that we do when we invest in other traditional capital investments, things like buildings and technology and equipment. And so the trend is really about, within the training and development field, looking at our programs as an investment. That's where resources are allocated. And then ultimately knowing what kind of impact those programs have and can have on the organization and being more effective and efficient with those.
Super, super. So you obviously mentioned training again, Chris. You've been around this for quite some time. What are some of the biggest changes of the training, people, human capital development landscape that you've seen over the last 15, 20 years take place in the organization? What are some of the biggest changes you've seen out there?
Well, some of the trends that we're seeing are emphasis on things like coaching and leadership development, which is an extension or maybe a focus within training and development. But there's still the investment of resources and time, and probably more so now, things like compliance and other legal concerns are driving the need for organizations to make sure that their staff and their people are up to speed on the terminology, the procedures, and the processes that are important to their business or their industry.
Okay, super. You mentioned trends, and one of the things that I wanted to talk about for this particular session, Training Magazine, they came out with their top trends that they saw taking place in training for 2015. They kind of identified 5 items. 2 that I thought would be relevant for us to kind of talk a little bit about today because it relates to bottom line ROI. One was aligning training with business goals, not just training for the sake of training, but making sure that the training is aligned with the organization is trying to do. And also measuring the effectiveness of training. What type of impact did it have? So can you talk about what you're seeing in those trends, what your organization does to touch on those items?
Well, it's actually a great topic for me to expand on because that's exactly what we do. So a little background because it'll put some context to this comment, but most people in the training field are familiar with Kirkpatrick's adult learning or the theory of change. And that's the 4 steps to evaluating training. And essentially it is for behavior to change, there has to be a knowledge transfer that's relevant. What Jack Phillips did when he was working for Lockheed Martin in 1970, he was in the training and development group, and his stakeholder or executive came to him and said, how can we evaluate the ROI of this project and program that they were working on? And so Jack ultimately turned to the only resource that was available, and it was published by ATD, Don Kirkpatrick's theory. And at that point, it was just a theory. It wasn't put into place as practice. And essentially applied the cost-benefit analysis theory to Kirkpatrick's model of evaluating training. And then said if there was a behavior change, there can be an impact or a consequence to the organization. What does that look like in terms of dollars and cents? And then ultimately convert that to an ROI by comparing to the cost. So what he built was that logical framework that helps us look at what is important to the business and how do we make sure that our programs are aligned with that by looking at what are the consequences or the desired needs of the organization. What's the behavior that has to change to accomplish that, which are the two critical components, but we also have to have the skill set and then the relevance, or what's called level one. So that's the framework for helping do a needs analysis and designing a program. It's also the framework we use for evaluating. We go back and we look at each of those key categories of our program and evaluate and gather data that says to what degree were we successful and how efficiently were we successful.
Okay, super, super. So, Chris, if an organization wanted to do more of that, again, making sure that they're linking training to business results, making sure that they're laying the right foundation to measure the results at the end, how would somebody in training make sure they're focused on those items up front? What would they need to do to make sure they're capturing that as part of their, plan for developing, enhancing training inside of their organization?
Well, obviously, they have to have a logical framework, which we provide. But even if they're not using the ROI methodology, they have to answer ultimately the question: why is this important to the business? How are we going to accomplish it? And then what are we going to measure to determine our success? So by asking those three questions, then they can at least have focus on making sure that the programs are connected to the business in driving change in behavior and consequence or impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So by asking that question, why is it important, how are we going to do it, and what's our measure of success?
Gotcha, gotcha. Chris, something that you mentioned I wanted to go back a little bit on, if you wouldn't mind talking about this, and I was going to ask you to do it when we did your opening introduction, but as I was looking at your group, you guys are partnered with ATD and doing some work with that organization. Can you share what you're doing with ATD?
Absolutely. So ATD is probably one of our biggest sponsors, and they published Jack's first book on the ROI methodology. And since then, I believe 46 different books have been published in partnership with the ROI Institute and ATD. And actually, this week, just got a note from ATD that one of their top 12 books of 2015 is measuring the success of leadership and development in terms of business impact and ROI, that was published in partnership with our two organizations. So it's a long-standing relationship. ATD is also the one that first published Don Kirkpatrick's model. So there's consistency in the application of this framework that has matured and evolved with the ROI Institute, but there's consistency in using that as a logical framework for program design and evaluation for going on 45 years now.
Super, super. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So, Chris, certainly I've gotten a lot of great things about this, and kind of what this says to me, and again, I think it's something that more and more training professionals are really trying to focus on is, again, you talked about different types of compliance training, those things that everybody just has to do, but really focusing back on training that's designed to really move the organization forward, and how do you measure that? And certainly that kind of ties back into getting adoption from senior management for people to invest in training. If they can look back and see the ROI metrics associated with it, that certainly helps things out. So great stuff there. Chris, let me just ask you this one. So certainly you've shared some great things at this point. I know you kind of touched about how you get ROI going as you're laying out the foundation. If you were talking to somebody here, and you certainly have this captive audience of great training professionals, and you want to kind of give them advice about here are some things that you really want to consider as you're looking to enhance and develop your training program inside of your organization, what types of things would you share with our audience here on that side?
So I think ultimately it's about proving value. In this time, especially coming out of the recession that happened in 2009, businesses are much more critical about resource allocation. And so ultimately, we want to be perceived as an investment as opposed to a cost. And I think
Mhm.
that's the biggest challenge that a lot of training and development professionals are facing now. When programs or budgets are tightened, ultimately they're looking to cut costs. And you don't want to be viewed as a cost. You want to be viewed as providing value. We invest in, we allocate resources for investments, we cut costs. So that's the mindset shift that I would recommend for anyone, even if you're not evaluating to a level 5 ROI or using the ROI methodology, ultimately demonstrating value in terms that the business recognizes. So things like productivity, revenue, cost, time, where we're making improvements and moving the measures there are critical for people to think of moving forward with any of their programs.
Yeah. Adding value to the organization. Great point there, Chris. Great point. Thank you for that. So, Chris, great stuff, and I certainly got a lot of great information from that, and I appreciate you sharing it with the audience. I'm sure our audience did as well. I think you have a giveaway or an offer that you wanted to make available to our audience here. You want to talk about what you and your organization are going to be making available?
Yeah, absolutely. So the ROI Institute is in their 20th year of providing the certification of the ROI methodology. It's a 5-day intensive skill building program and is the best way to build capability and the skills and gather the resources you need to be able to evaluate all types of programs, projects, and initiatives. We do this throughout the U.S. In the calendar year, typically 10 to 15 times. So what we're offering to the audience that's attending today's session is a 10% discount off of that registration fee, and it can be combined with the early bird registration that is in advance of 30 days of the event itself for up to 20% total. To be able to redeem that, all they need to do is go to roiinstitute.net. They can go to the events calendar, see the full list of certification offerings, dates, and locations, and use the promo code ROI10, that's the number 10, 10, offer, OFFER. So ROI10 offer, and that'll take 10% off their registration instantaneously.
Good deal. Thank you for that, Chris. Great offer, and I'm sure that you'll help many of our viewers here that'll be participating in that. So great offer. Thank you for that. Again, thank you for the time. Again, great insight, great information that looks about how do you not just do training for the sake of training, but how do you make sure that it's effective. So I'm sure that there were a lot of great things and tips that our audience picked up on that. So thank you again. Also want to thank our audience for joining us for this particular session. We would encourage you to continue to come back for other breakthrough ideas and training webinar series. Thank you for your time. Have a great day.
Thank you.